Right, everyone. We're just gonna get started here. Just get Pierre to join. Okay, let's see if this works. Oh, there we go. Looks like we're having some issues here. There we go.
Hello. Hey,
Pierre,
what's up?
not much. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's good to see you.
Likewise.
How
Yeah,
are you feeling
I'm
today?
feeling a lot better from our last live, so I'm ready to
Good.
rock and roll.
Sweet. I'm glad to
Yeah,
hear it.
thanks.
Excellent.
Yeah, technology has not been my friend today, so
No
hoping
sweat.
things things go smooth from here on.
No sweat. If
All
things
right.
don't,
So
I'll start us up again.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. Um, cool. So we're talking about male archetypes today. I'm just pulling up my notes. There's a lot to talk about as we
There is a
discussed.
lot.
Yeah.
Danny
And
boy, hello.
yeah, hey everyone. So yeah, where would you like to start? Like, do you want to give a brief overview of what the archetypes are? And then I think we wanted to touch on the king archetype specifically today, and then the shadows that come with the king archetype if they're not integrated appropriately. So maybe we
Yeah,
can, yeah,
sure. And I think to your point, uh, since we last spoke, I'm sort of back and forth over how much of the archetypes to share. And
yeah,
I think to your point, it probably makes sense to go over the archetypes themselves and just what they really represent, how
hmm
they show up. And then if we get the opportunity to really delve into the shadows around the king, that's an extra win for
yeah,
today. Yeah,
yeah. I think we could touch on each one. Probably not get into too much detail, and I think when we spoke offline, our goal today is to probably get into some detail
the
around the king
king.
archetype. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
which is kind of backwards in a way, because based on the research I was doing, is the king archetype is pretty much at the top, and someone who's fully integrated that archetype has also had to integrate the other three, and that's
True.
very important because as a king in the king archetype, you're drawing on the qualities of the other ones to find that well-rounded aspect. So
Yeah.
we'll get into that a little bit later, but let's maybe start at the beginning and what these archetypes mean and where they basically came from and some of the context behind each one.
That makes good sense. And so we're really talking about the four archetypes from the king, lover, the king, warrior, magician, lover book by Moore and Gillette, which
Yep.
kind of builds upon the masculine archetypes as they're based in Carl Jung's work
Mm-hmm.
around the animus and associated archetypes, both for men and for women. Now,
Yes.
uh, for really for everyone, archetypes at large, regardless of gender.
Yes.
And in this case, the book is outlining 4 archetypes that develop from boyhood into manhood.
Yep.
And I think that becomes particularly important when we look at the evolution and maturity of each of these individual archetypes, which we'll go through. But the sort of premise is that as a boy, or as an immature, in the immature phase of manhood, we are slaves to our egos. That
Mm-hmm.
essentially we are not integrated. We maybe feel easily insulted, not have our values drawn very clearly, may feel restless,
Mm-hmm.
seeking recognition for the sake of puffing ourselves up or for the sake of building ourselves and our egos.
Yep.
Whereas for men, it's and in the mature phase, it's really a mastery of ego. It's
Yes.
in service of our values, and the authors then go into these 4 archetypes: the king, the warrior, the magician, the lover, which we can delve into more readily. Is there any other background that feels really relevant before we start kind of
Yeah, I think
delving
there's
into each one?
the one thing I would add, there's also an aspect of insecurity that
Hmm.
comes up as men, and that's where that potentially that immaturity comes in. So I'm glad you touched on the immaturity because there is that aspect of maturity to be able to integrate all of that, and quite often we will go to extreme lengths to, and that's where we'll talk about the shadow side of each archetype, specifically the king, where there's an aspect of insecurity where we're trying to flex, and that's where we end up in the shadow side if we haven't fully integrated that side of ourselves or gained that maturity and being comfortable with who we are. And obviously those behaviors present themselves as immaturity, and we see that in men even in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, where they lack confidence, lack a sense of self. And to your point as well, there is a need for a greater purpose where we talk about that quite often, but even as a king, it's not about just having this influence or power. It's thinking about what is there outside yourself, this greater sense of purpose. The common quote that comes up is leaving a place or people better than when you found it, right? So keeping that in mind. So yeah,
Yeah.
just wanted to touch on that. I'm just looking at, oh, and then the other thing I made a note of is to distinguish that these archetypes are not personality types.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to confuse the two, that, oh, do I fit into this personality? No, this is different. I just wanted
Mm-hmm.
to distinguish between that. Yeah, I think that kind of covers. I mean, yeah, the shadows
Hmm.
again. They're really the dysfunctional side of our personalities. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. The this transition and building of maturity um, doesn't necessarily happen at adulthood. That
Hmm.
there are relevant pieces of what the authors call boyhood psychology that seep into especially the shadows of manhood, and each
Hmm.
it may also kind of look at the shadow, which we covered the last time, in this really interesting way around each. There's a sort of a pyramid structure where at the top is the mature masculine archetype, but then the two uh, the two poles of the shadow are active and passive, and they often involve the active or perhaps passive, maybe in some cases passively aggressive
Hmm.
ways in which these archetypes show up when they're not fully integrated, when we're not fully mature, or when
Hmm.
we're in situations in which are we're either trying to keep our egos safe
Yes.
and puffed up, or we project the power of that archetype onto other people and then feel a void within us.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's really it's a fascinating look at shadows in a way that feels more nuanced. They're
Hmm.
not bits of us that are just active and actively hurting ourselves or others. They can
Right.
be in this sort of passive pull, which feels important.
Yes, yes. It's funny you mentioned it's almost like a pyramid. I view it like often even as a pendulum where
Hmm.
you will swing from one shadow to the other, and quite often these shadows work in tandem, right? It doesn't mean that oh you're on one end and you almost pull. There's that pull back and forth, and until you don't find that right balance, you can't really uh, get that integration. So it's
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah.
Yeah, fair. Uh, all right. And so where do we go from here?
Well, before we get into the integration side, I wanted to well, first of all, I'm going to try to address this comment.
Yeah.
If your mental health is in jeopardy, I would advise you seek help. Um, and definitely it's important to do that. So I'm not sure we can offer anything right now, but I would encourage this person if you're really struggling to seek help. There's definitely resources out there. If you want to get in touch with me, I can see if I can do anything depending on where you're located. But yeah, I don't want to just ignore that comment.
Ah, yes. Likewise.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry. So I wanted to touch. I came across this quote this morning, timely enough, around balance, and we're
Mhm.
going to touch on the shadows. I'm just going to pull it up here. It's from Aristotle. I thought it was quite relevant for this, and I don't know if it's going to land the same.
Yeah.
However, he said, in each case, it is hard work to find the intermediate. For instance, not everyone, but only one who knows, finds the midpoint in a circle.
Hmm.
So I found that quite interesting because that is the battle,
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
finding that right balance. And throughout our lives, I think even if you find that balance, there's going to be new challenges and new obstacles that will test us
Hmm.
and force us almost to continue to find that balance. So,
Yeah.
anyways,
That makes good sense. I like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you for sharing that one.
yeah. You're welcome. So shifting to the king, um, the we've talked about the shadows. So when not fully integrated with the king, you either have the tyrant on one end and then the weakling on the other end.
Hmm.
And we will definitely address those as we go along. So maybe do you want to touch on the king archetype?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Uh, and then we'll touch upon, actually, let's touch upon Danny Boy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh, no, it's appreciated. Um, it's important that you do. I would
mhm.
invite you to reach out to one of us for perhaps for next steps, even if we ourselves um, can't offer direct help or direct support. I think I can speak for both of us in saying we'd certainly love to help you on your path.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah. I
sorry you're
mean,
going through this.
absolutely. Definitely not easy, and especially with
Not
six
at
kids
all.
involved. So I
Yeah.
can't understand the pain, but I can
Well,
appreciate it must be difficult. So yeah, after this live, I'll check if I have a message from you. I will see what I can do to connect with you with the right person or people.
Likewise. Likewise. All right. So delving into the archetypes themselves, there's sort of and I want to piggyback on what you mentioned around them not being personality types. There are, in many ways, parts of all of us. We can explore and express the experiences of each of these archetypes simultaneously, individually, in parallel, in series. And in many ways, the king is kind of seen as the integrating force of all of these.
Yes.
So in many ways, is kind of the top of the rung here.
Yes,
but the king is the sort of the archetype that honors and values leadership and purpose and order and even divinity or giving blessings. You sort of think about the experience of a benevolent leader or a king who leads with heart. The mature king is really all about generativity, all about creating something for the benefit of humanity and people at large. And so when I think of the king, I really think probably the biggest words that come to mind are purpose and leadership and blessings.
Yes.
I'm curious about what comes up for you.
Yeah, and I think blessings is one thing I paid attention to, because we quite often assume blessings mean we're, like it's like spiritual. Oh, I'm blessing. Yeah, very spiritual or religious for that purpose. But I think blessing also means kind of helping others, inspiring others, and finding that greater purpose that you touched on. I think for me, what jumps out, and based on the research I did, when the king archetype has been integrated in its fullness, an individual feels centered. So there's that confidence that comes around with that, and a sense of purpose that we've touched on a few times here. And I think, using Jordan Peterson's words, it's being able to create order when in chaos, being able to find that balance. I think one of the biggest signs of confidence that with the king archetype I would see is someone who doesn't react, but rather takes the time, pauses, and then acts accordingly. So that's a difference. I think that when there's that level of immaturity, something I can speak for myself that I've experienced is that tendency to react. And you touched on earlier, when our ego gets bruised, our immediate tendency is to react, right? And project onto others. So I think there's that aspect of being able to act rather than react. And there's a sense of decisiveness. We see that quite often when people are experiencing that immaturity. They're never really comfortable with a decision. They're seeking that external validation when it pertains to their decision making. So there's that aspect there. And I think there's also a difference between, and we'll touch on the shadow side of it as a tyrant, but there's an assertiveness that comes, right? And I think that means setting boundaries, but not really abusing your power or your influence, for that matter, but being assertive. And that's where, when the king is assertive, that archetype, when fully integrated, is drawing on the warrior archetype. It's pulling from there. And then and being disciplined. That's another area I think the king represents, is that level of discipline where that archetype will draw from the magician. So and I think there's the larger purpose I wanted to touch on, which I found really powerful, is and you see it with men in society is where they will mentor other men. And I don't think there's a level of hierarchy there. I think we can mentor each other as peers. We can mentor men that are either younger than us or even older than us. And we see that quite a bit. I see that in the men's group I attend, where there's no hierarchy. We're mentoring each other, we're supporting each other, and that's a sign of the king archetype in its fullness, is having that willingness to look outside yourself and helping other men as well.
Yeah, agreed. I think you speak to this important point around this not being a matter of hierarchy above other men or other individuals. It's not you as the king and everyone else as your minion.
Yes.
This is you showing up as the king in your own domain, in your own life, and inspiring other people to show up in their fullest. And so this is really, it speaks to kind of the inner workings and the inner game here, the building a mindset. And beyond, I think, the mindset, there's a spiritual element to much of this. We connect through to the energies from each of these archetypes, often in appreciating parts of us that are very much outside of our heads. I suppose with one exception, and even that in the magician, a big chunk of that work and that the drawing of energy around the magician is really around building an awareness to truth, rather than sort of the inner workings of our own individual brain. David asked if archetypes are born or made, and I think in the book often they're, or at least speaking to sort of the way in which they're outlined in the book, the answer would be both. That one may be born humanity, we as humans may be born with the sort of the wiring for each of these archetypes, but that we see them evolve and transform over time into either a mature conglomeration of different archetypes, or ones in which different archetypes to differing degrees have matured. And so I suppose they're born, but then in their full mature natures are made.
Yeah, I think my perspective is a bit different. I'll speak to the shadows. I think the shadows of the archetypes are made because those are parts of ourselves that often get repressed. So whether you're a lover, you identify as a lover, magician, warrior, or even the king, those insecurities we have are made based on our life experiences or parts of ourselves that we've repressed. And then they continue to show up over and over again as the shadow self, which is based on Carl Jung's work that you alluded to earlier. So it's a great question. I haven't really put a lot of thought into it. I think to your point, it is a bit of both. Perhaps something we would need to dig into a bit deeper for the next one and touch on. So
that's a really good question.
Yeah, from my perspective, I could see more of it being made based on our experiences. However, I think that we are born with certain natural tendencies. It's that question that I've heard growing up is, are leaders born or are they made? And you can argue both, right? There's that aspect of nature versus nurture. So perhaps something to dive into deeper in the next live.
Yeah, DK, thank you for that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about the king, and I think for people that were interested or are interested, understanding, when you've integrated the king archetype within yourself, we talked about the qualities that would present themselves
Mm-hmm.
as a king. Now, how about the shadow sides of the king, and perhaps starting with the tyrant?
Yeah, yeah. I think in a lot of ways the tyrant is a lot easier to sort of appreciate. It's the active the active shadow of the king archetype, where uh, rather than focusing the energy on the leadership, the direction, the purpose, the focus is so much on one's own sense of power and ego and the fragility thereof,
Mm-hmm.
that that a man acts as a tyrant, in essence, um, uh, is demanding and belittling and disempowering other people in
Mm-hmm.
an
Mm-hmm.
effort to advance
Yes.
himself, or to cover up or in response to the fragility of his own ego. And
Mm-hmm.
so you might degrade other people, um, and be extraordinarily sensitive to criticism, or rageful.
Mm-hmm.
And when we see this as the the sort of the the angry the angry leader who dominates, and not
Yes.
in response to the needs of people around him.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
pretty. It's relevant right now,
it is
considering
very relevant right now.
what's going on in the world.
Yeah,
Yes.
it most
Yeah.
certainly is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think we could see people like that in society, whether they're bullying others. There's an aspect of bullying, like you said, degrading or disempowering others, tearing them down. Um, and then there's the other aspect where the tyrant will use manipulation to get what they want, and that can come off as, and manipulation is very subtle in times and also obvious, but there's people who would use, they'll become your best friend and tell you things that
Mhm.
you want to hear, and then in the background not really looking out for your best interests. So those are some of the things you can see with the shadow side of the king, being the tyrant. Not sure if you have any additional thoughts around that.
No, I, I I think the range of possible expressions thereof is really broad, from belittling in subtle ways to completely destroying. Again,
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing we're seeing that in action.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And I guess the other shadow, then, if you were to look at the other end of the spectrum, is the weakling. And I just want to reinforce that these sides of the king often, I would say, exist in tandem. You don't have one without the other. So, for
Hmm.
example, when a person, the weakling shadow will often overcompensate and use those qualities of the tyrant to compensate for the weakling side, because,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, the fragility of the ego is so prominent in that case, and we touched on earlier, it presents itself as insecurities or just immaturity. So what are some things that show up if you're not fully integrating that weakling shadow?
Yeah. So paranoia, the sense
Mm-hmm.
that other people are disloyal, or they're trying to overwhelm your authority. And so you sort of start to develop this sense that people are out to disempower you. You've essentially projected all of the power that you may have onto someone else, and then believe that they're either subtly or overtly trying to undermine you. Um, and so, in essence, you act in this passive, weak way to a point. And I think to your point, what often we then see is people undertake these passive aggressive maneuvers to essentially bring out the tyrant. It may not be in full force, but it may be sort of this underlying hateful, potentially destructive energy that that comes out in response to this fear that other people are overtaking one's power. And I think a question was raised.
Yes. Yeah, I
Yes.
was going to address that. I think
Absolutely.
the question around, can you have more than one archetype? Absolutely. I think they can exist at any point, perhaps even more so as you age. You can definitely evolve from one type to the other, but I think my perception is they would exist, and I think you touched on it earlier, Pierre, as well, is they often exist in different realms, and they show up depending on the situation. And the goal then is to, as we've talked about earlier, is to be able to integrate them all. And you'll see it as well, like, in certain scenarios, the king archetype may show up, whether you're running a meeting or you're at work or even in your community, and at some parts your lover archetype may show up. And yeah, so I don't know what your thoughts are here.
Yeah, totally agreed. I think they all reside within us, and to some extent, they naturally evolve as we pay attention to them, as we recognize where they show up in our lives and how we want to potentially cultivate them. And I think just looking at myself, when I first read this book years ago, I think I saw myself more in one particular archetype than seeing all of these archetypes within me. And so that has definitely evolved. And I do think it evolves, especially with age.
Yes.
And
yes.
Probably with more personal development and inner work. I would say most men find that their king archetype tends to show up more fully. And maybe that's a reflection, as you've mentioned before, on honing and channeling different energies from all of the archetypes into a mature masculine king.
Yes.
And I think a couple of questions just came
up. Yeah, more questions popping up. So from the Boulder Man guys,
what's up,
shame,
Boulder Man guys?
the shame about being on one of the shadow poles prevent you from stepping into the king, warrior, magician, or lover. Absolutely. I think when we touched on insecurity, I think parts of insecurity come from shame as well. And I think I touched on it. If we've repressed that part of ourselves, then absolutely it's preventing you from stepping fully into either archetype. I can speak for myself, and I've mentioned this earlier, but if someone would have told me earlier in life, especially in my 20s, when we're struggling with our ego, you're not a king, you're a lover, I would have carried shame with that. And it would have really prevented me from accepting that part of myself. And I think, as we've touched on, when you're in that one shadow, whether it's shame or guilt or some message you received early in life, you're always swinging back and forth on that pendulum and trying to overcompensate in one way or the other, never really finding that balance in the middle and stepping into full acceptance. So that's kind of my response. I don't know, Pierre.
No, I agree. And I think recognizing all of these archetypes as evolving within us and not necessarily pitting them against one. I mean, I know
Hmm.
in many ways, like we all want to be the king, and there is an element of the king embodying all of the elements of the various archetypes. They're all important and all necessary within us, and they're necessary within different realms of our lives. And I think that sort of takes us to the question that David asked about
Yes.
whether there can be multiple uh, kings or warriors or magicians or lovers within a community or within a relationship. And most certainly, I think
Absolutely.
the challenge is when the shadows emerge and conflict.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but these are all really inner workings, and part of the part of the work around men's group work is really helping other men to show up more fully in these archetypes, and often
Hmm.
particularly in the king archetype.
Yes.
That's often where many men want to build and develop, particularly
Hmm.
in relation to one another and in within their communities. But you can absolutely have a community of strong,
Yep.
mature kings.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if present in the immature type, they will often repel each other, to David's point.
Yeah,
You see that quite a bit in communities, in the workplace. You're in a meeting and there's more than one person trying to grab the center of attention or get their opinion heard or get their decision at the forefront. And I think once you fully integrated your shadows, depending on what archetype, even as the king, you're comfortable. You have that confidence. So if someone's trying to overpower you, you have that awareness that maybe this is for the greater good, and let's look at the bigger picture here rather than my ego or how I can get the last word in. And there's all that does exist in society, and again, we're seeing that everywhere almost.
yeah, yeah, most certainly. And you know when there's like it's a pissing match for attention, not for the general good of the cause at large, but really to size people up, to have the last word, to be seen as
Hmm.
the person who's coming up with a good idea.
Yeah.
Uh, this is these shadow parts are not necessarily uh, in favor of the greater good or even the values that are associated with the the individual archetypes. They're often in support um, of holding up what may otherwise feel like a fragility of ego.
Yes. Yeah. um Sorry, I'm just making a note here, but going back to the weakling, I don't think we really fully tackled it and completed it, but I think there's an aspect of, again, at an immaturity level, you often see that with men, where they like to give their power up. They're indecisive.
Yeah,
They don't want to take ownership. It's like, oh, I can just easily just, kind of let someone else uh, take the
call
reins
the
and
shots.
just,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And I think that also presents itself where they're not able to take control of their life or often responsibility. Where I'll use an example, it might trigger some people, but I think you see that where I'll speak specifically to men who've either had childhood trauma or childhood wounding, and
mm-hmm.
either they'll continue to blame their circumstances, parents, other adults in their lives, rather than acknowledging, yeah, that whatever happened, yet it wasn't great, but now it's, as we enter adulthood and we want to be mature men, we want to take that responsibility for ourselves and our lives, and take control from that perspective. So
Yeah,
that's where that set comes up. It's playing that victim and blaming others, and then often what happens is, again, you try to overcompensate it by bullying others or manipulating others as the tyrant. So I think that's how for me, the weakling presents itself as that shadow self.
Yeah, that makes good sense. I see it a lot in men who are stuck in or feel stuck in a relationship or a job, and very much have the power, the capability to make a change, but may not necessarily see the insight or have the sort of insight that they're capable of making that change, and begin to blame someone else and empower someone else against his unhappiness, and then are disempowered, but constantly complaining that the other person is keeping them from happiness.
Yes.
I've seen this a lot in I think growing up in relationships, and then really not taking the ownership around showing up fully presently with full purpose, and then blaming their spouses for somehow containing them and not letting them be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it all comes back full circle to the ego, because the ego is so fragile. And you know, another example is when people get passed over for a promotion or any opportunity, they'll blame the circumstances or they'll look for excuses, because that's what the ego is telling them to do, rather than take responsibility. And sometimes, yeah, I mean, things happen, they're outside our control, and you know, we do things could be perceived as unfair. That's just the reality. But I mean, we give up our power by blaming circumstances or others and not taking full responsibility. And I think in society, if as men we can all aspire to integrate these shadows and archetypes and truly try to hone in as the king, I think there's an opportunity for everyone to be the king in their own lives.
Totally.
So that's what we should focus on. You know, like, I think we touched on those qualities, at least the ones I wrote down, and then like to kind of summarize, if you truly want to embody that king in your life and be the king in your life, is feel centered, be decisive, be disciplined, help others, inspire others, mentor others. Those are all the things you can do. And I know you had a few other qualities.
Yeah, most certainly. I think when you're looking to develop the king, you start things, you lead. I think often that ends up creating a tremendous opportunity to build up this element of our king. You could argue, and I think this will take us to a near stop point since we're at time. You also build up the capacity to explore the other archetypes, the warrior, the magician, the lover, and you pull those experiences into the king energy, the energies around purpose and order and leadership. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. One last question. From a therapeutic perspective, absolutely. I mean, therapy has been huge for me to be able to acknowledge the shadow sides and aspire to integrate them. So definitely therapy can help. Often it's having someone else identify them or even guiding you through that integration. I'm not sure about medicine, but I don't know, Pierre, I think you have way more experience in that side.
Well, you know, I can say, in fairness, I don't know that I've ever thought of the archetypes as I've thought about treating with medication. But what I have thought about is, and what often emerges in the mix of psychotherapy and medication management, is essentially mitigating distressing or functionally impairing patterns
Yeah.
that might hold us back from being able to acknowledge or harness or tap into or utilize these aspects of our personalities and ourselves. And
Yes.
so if someone is in the mix of a major depressive episode, for example, he may not be able to see himself as a king.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thought patterns and the neurophysiologic, and frankly, physiologic patterns outside of the sort of neural networks may keep you from being able to see yourself as leading or having purpose or having order, maintaining order. The same goes for any other condition that may lead to distressing thoughts. So certainly OCD and PTSD and other anxiety disorders, they're going to interfere with the capacity to connect as a lover, or the capacity to introspect as a magician, or the capacity to act as a warrior.
Right.
And so I'd say that's important. The other element that I'm not sure if this question alluded to, but is a fascinating one, and one that I have sort of mixed feelings about, and also think we ought to cover on one of these lives, is using psychedelic medications or ketamine. And I feel like it has come up more and more around wanting to sort of go on an ayahuasca trip in order to open up these elements, which I have lots of opinions on. But I think that may be another very interesting area for us to look at.
Yeah. Well, especially the kind of the attention and research that psychedelics are getting right now. I think it's definitely relevant. I guess one of the things I wanted to maybe address and perhaps pose as a question to yourself is, often with these shadow sides of the archetypes, there is dysfunction, right? And it could be fairly severe, almost to disorders. And I would assume medication would help you get to a baseline functioning, where then you can utilize therapy to fully integrate. But I think the purpose of medicine is to be able to help you get to that baseline functioning and then be able to work through it. Obviously, I don't have experience in that field, but I think that's kind of the idea, right?
Yeah. It certainly is. I think where we probably can touch up, and certainly as we touch upon the other archetypes, there's undoubtedly the opportunity to touch upon how pathology may show up. Often we see that more in the realm of pathologic character traits. And so in those cases, there may not be a sort of pharmacologic response, and there may be patterns that are difficult to undo, frankly, even immutable. But in most cases, these shadows are not, they're not so prominent for any of us that they become in and of themselves pathology, but they can certainly show up as parts of personality disorders.
No, great. I think it's time to wrap up.
It's time.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and engaging. Questions were great. And I guess for the next live, we've set it up well, where we'll touch on the other three archetypes, that being the warrior, the magician, and the lover, and obviously touching on the shadow sides of each one. Hopefully we'll be able to do that in the allotted time. But thanks again, Pierre, for taking the time and doing this.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, looking forward to the next one in a couple of weeks.
2 weeks.
And and you and I will connect offline, but we'll see everyone else in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
And likewise.
Thank you
Enjoy
for
the rest
everyone
of your Saturday.
who's joined. Yep. You too.